Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak with you today. My name is Kathy Guillermo. I'm with People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. I've worked with PETA for 30 years now, 30 wonderful years, and I really wish that I could be there with you. Family emergency has kept me in the United States, but I'm happy to be able to address you in this format, better than nothing. On Sunday, New York Times reporter Joe Drape wrote, "This old, tradition-steeped American sport could not withstand another controversy or catastrophe. Dead horses, too many of them, have drawn a bullseye around its existence. Horse racing is on the ropes, big time." And in the United States it is. I realize that international racing is different from racing here in the United States, and I'm not the first person to say this. If U.S. thoroughbred racing doesn't clean up its act, its very survival is at risk. The betting handle has dropped significantly in recent years when adjusted for inflation. In the last 15 years, the full crop is half of what it was. And yet, consistently, U.S. racing has refused to deal with what is arguably its biggest problem, the public's belief that racing is cruel. Two recent polls show that only 20% of the American public thinks racing is great. An equal percentage thinks it should be banned, and basically everybody else doesn't care. Over the decade that I've been working on racing reform, the response on the part of the U.S. racing industry to this public attitude has been more about promotion than about dealing with what the public doesn't like. The problem, we hear consistently, is perception. But the problem is not perception. The problem is reality. 5 years ago, PETA released an undercover investigation of a prominent American thoroughbred trainer. And this is what we learned. This went on not only in this trainer's barn, but in all the barns of the horses we saw during this 10-month or so undercover investigation. That essentially all thoroughbreds were getting a daily cocktail of anti-inflammatories, muscle relaxers, painkillers, sedatives, and weirdly, a scoop of thyroxine medication in every single food bucket every night, even though none of the horses had been diagnosed with thyroid disease. There were stacks of pre-signed Lasix forms that a veterinarian was just handing out to whoever requested them. This caused quite a big scandal in 2014 when it was released, and the upshot is that in New York, the trainer was fined $10,000 for the medication use. The veterinarian who was handing out the pre-signed Lasix forms was also fined. There was a horrified reaction throughout the American racing industry. There were the people on one side who said this was not fair, this is what goes on all the time, this is how we do our business, you can't tell us what to do. And there were people on the other side of racing who said, this is time, this is our moment to clean up racing. Horses don't need to be on these kinds of medications, so let's clean it up. Federal legislation was introduced, the Horse Racing Integrity Act. And then it was back to business as usual. During those 5 years between that investigation and now, the public attitude toward the way animals are treated has evolved. We have seen the end of Ringling Brothers Circus in the United States, for example. Not the end of all animal circuses, but certainly the end of that big one. We've seen the explosion in interest in vegan and vegetarian food, which I think has already been in Europe for some time. We're following you. And we have seen an interest on the part of people to make sure that animals are treated well. So when it was announced publicly that 23 thoroughbreds had died at Santa Anita Park, most of them from catastrophic breakdowns and then euthanasia, the public reaction was different from anything that we have seen in the past. We have a public that's no longer willing to stand for the deaths of horses on the racetrack. The Stronach Group, which owns Santa Anita, as well as Gulfstream and Pimlico and some other tracks, acknowledged what many people in racing have been saying, and they used this opportunity as a platform to say racing needs to change in the United States. It needs to be cleaned up. We know that medications are keeping injured horses running when they shouldn't be, and that this is what is causing breakdowns. And the necropsies that are done on the horses who die show this. More than 90% of all horses who suffer catastrophic breakdown on tracks have a pre-existing injury. There is something going on in the bones of their legs. Why are the veterinarians not seeing this? Well, perhaps in some cases the injury is so new, it's just not showing yet. But in most of these cases, it's that cocktail of medications that are keeping the horse from feeling the injury and thus keeping the veterinarian from seeing the injury, and the horse goes on the track, and the horse breakdowns and dies. This has led to some really significant change in California. It's still in process, but to begin with, Santa Anita was able to get agreement from the owners and trainers of California and to go to the California Horse Racing Board, which oversees racing in California, and bring about some significant changes. About a dozen anti-inflammatory drugs have been banned. Lasix, very controversial here in the United States, will be phased out, and veterinary inspections will be increased. The whip will be banned. There are some other changes that go along with this, but those are the most significant, I think, in terms of trying to prevent these breakdowns, and they're crucial for every jurisdiction in the U.S. to adopt. We're working now with the California governor's staff to strengthen these even more, and we think, and many in racing agree, that there should be no drugs in the 2 weeks before a race. Now, I'm not talking about the sedative that a horse may need in order to put new shoes on him. We're talking about phenylbutazone, which in the U.S. can be legally given to every single horse who races either 24 or 48 hours before a race. Why is that? Horses who may not be injured are still getting bute. Why is that? Well, it seems pretty obvious to us that it's to enhance the performance of the horse. This is the kind of thing that has to end. We believe that only the safest surface should be used in racing, and in the United States, statistically, that's the synthetic track. And we know that's controversial here, but fewer horses die on a synthetic track than they do either on dirt or on turf in the United States. 2-year-olds should not be subjected to timed sprints, which is something that is done commonly here in the U.S. in the 2-year-old auctions, where many of these or some of these horses break down as a result or are ruined and can no longer race after that. Joint injections and shockwave therapy should either be banned or so restricted that they're rarely, if ever, used. There must be a longer time frame in between when these can be administered, and it must be monitored. This is just the beginning of what we see as the reform of horse racing in the U.S. And I realize that in Europe the situation is different, and in other parts of the world. The United States needs to move toward the European model or the Hong Kong model when it comes to these horses, because as Joe Drape in the New York Times said, there will not be racing for very long if horses continue to die. And that's just the bottom line when it comes down to it. I do think that technology can play a role in horse racing, so that's part of the reason I was really happy to be able to address this crowd today. One of the technologies that PETA has been advocating for probably the last 4 years or so is a pilot study of a CT scan. And the veterinarian who has developed this, Dr. Sheila Lyons, worked with the scan company Curvebeam to develop this really unique and interesting and cutting-edge technology. And if I may read to you just a little bit about it. Curvebeams, first of all, their high-resolution human medical 3D CT scanning equipment was FDA approved in 2012, and the FDA is our Food and Drug Administration that has to approve all medical devices. It's quickly becoming the new standard in human orthopedics and podiatry, and it's the first CT scanner which enables the human patient to be examined while standing and while loading their limbs normally. So they're not lying down with their feet up. They're standing, and we see what the pressure of their weight on their limbs can do. This is a huge diagnostic advantage because both for humans and horse patients, when the anatomy is unweighted, it deprives the clinician of this critically important ability to analyze the stress areas of the bone under loading pressures. So until this equipment was developed, horses had to be anesthetized in order to have a CT scan, which I'm sure all of this audience knows. The inherent risks that are associated with general anesthesia, the need to go to a hospital for a test, and the cost of this procedure have prevented CT from being used in the majority of racehorses in training and eliminated its use as a screening tool by racing regulators and track practicing veterinarians. What's exciting about this technology is that it could be used as a screening tool and not just a diagnostic tool. The new 3D CT scanner developed by Dr. Lyons and Curvebeam is unique in some really important ways. First, as I just described, it allows the scan to be done in the standing horse. It scans both the front and the hind limbs simultaneously in less than 1 minute. This allows scans to be done on horses using very light, short-acting sedation comparable to what an X-ray or what a veterinarian at the track might use during an X-ray procedure. The scanner will be able to produce high-resolution 3D CT scans from above the carpus or tarsus through and including the hoof, with both right and left, front and hind limbs scanned simultaneously. Another unique feature of this new CT scanner is that it utilizes very low radiation, and this becomes important for both the horse and the technician's safety. The amount of radiation used is comparable to that required when taking a single human chest X-ray, whereas traditional CT scans are notorious for requiring very high radiation exposure. The equipment runs off a standard electrical outlet, making it easy to install or to use in any facility, and it can even be adapted to be installed in a trailer, which could then be moved from site to site, needing no more than a standard electric outlet for power. Physicians now are putting these human CTs in their offices to avoid the time and the trouble of sending their patients to traditional CT radiation or radiology facility. And the equipment cost is really low compared to regular or traditional CT scan equipment. So obviously used in connection with a reduction of medication and increase of veterinary inspections, the transparency of veterinary records so that those who are at the track can see, has a horse had a layoff, has a horse been treated for various injuries. When used in combination with those, this CT scan equipment could very well be exactly the screening technology that is needed to prevent horses from going on the track when they shouldn't be. Curvebeam and Dr. Sheila Lyons have been looking for a track to allow a pilot study, and before now I have not been able to get Del Mar or the US Jockey Club or Churchill Downs or Santa Anita for that matter interested in this technology, because before, horses dying on the track in the United States was pretty much business as usual. That can no longer be the case. We've seen that, and I think we've seen just from what's happened at the Kentucky Derby and then the day before the Preakness Stakes and at the Preakness Stakes, there is a huge amount of interest in what is happening to these animals now on the part of the media, because it's on the part of the public too. So if we can get this scan equipment into a barn, this could mean that a horse who is scanned and shows some kind of pathology that wouldn't be detectable in any other way in a limb, that horse could be, for example, put on the veterinarian's list and could not be run until the scan showed normal. And as I'm sure most people in this audience know far better than I, it's the micro damage that's done inside the bone and to the limbs that's not allowed to heal properly that then leads to the pathology, that leads to the breakdown, that leads to the death, which in the US may lead to the end of racing. So I believe technology does play an extremely important part in diagnosing these issues, in screening these horses before, and in protecting both the horses and the jockeys, because of course it's a danger to the jockeys if they're on horses who are going to break down and it hasn't been detected for whatever reasons that may be. Technology-wise, we were pleased to give an idea to to Amtote and the Stronach Group for a way to raise money for aftercare for horses, with simply suggesting a pop-up screen technology that could be on the betting terminals at the tracks, so that people placing bets could designate that a percentage of their win goes toward the aftercare of horses, which is a huge problem here in the US with thousands of thoroughbreds in past years going from the U.S. to Canada or Mexico into slaughter. And that's caused a few scandals in the industry itself. AmTote embraced this, developed the software. It's at many tracks in the U.S. now, and the way it works is that when the bettor puts the ticket in and cashes that ticket, they can designate that a certain amount, $1, $5, or I think it's $15, can go toward aftercare. We did a number of years ago, probably 8 or 9 years ago, suggest that in the United States, the chip technology, which at that time was new, be adapted to include all records of the horses, and we still advocate for this. There is some chip technology that is underway in the United States, and information is to be added to it. We call this the LIP chip, the lifetime. I forget now what it stands for. The lifetime something protection or passport, the LIP chip, and that name has stayed. They are calling it the LIP chip. Our idea was that everything about the horse could go into a computer program that this chip would be connected to, and it would be everything from veterinary records to medication records to turnout times, if that's available to the horses. Does the horse crib? Does the horse prefer to be in a stall next to another type of horse? Any information that would make the transition of going from one human being to another human being throughout that horse's life could be included in that, and simply scanning the chip and going onto the program would pull that information up for the horses. Just to conclude here quickly, I've touched on a number of things. I wish that I could be there to see European racing or Irish racing in any case, and I'm sorry that I'm not. However, I do think that the United States needs to look toward Europe. And if I were to suggest to the European audience something that they might consider, I would suggest considering the elimination of the whip. I'm not the only person who thinks this. In addition to most of the public, it's very hard for us to understand that you tell us that horses love to run, and yet you have to strike them repeatedly in the final seconds of a race in order to get them to do it. The compromise that was reached in California is that jockeys would be allowed to carry the whip for so-called safety reasons, but they would not be allowed to strike the horses with them in order to urge them to go forward. And at the Preakness Stakes, if you watched that over the weekend, you saw that unfortunately one horse unseated a rider, a jockey, and the horse then set about running the race anyway. And it occurred to me at that moment that a lot of people would be looking at that and thinking, well, that horse ran and nobody had to hit him. In fact, nobody had to be on him even. So I did, in fact, get a number of text messages from people suggesting that, well, there's your proof that the whip isn't needed. It does look bad, and it certainly is uncomfortable for the horse. So if there were any way that European racing were to look to U.S. racing for ideas on improvement, I would suggest looking at California and doing away with the whip, or at least for striking horses with the whip. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to put together this video. I wish that I could have been there in person again. I hope to make it there at some point. And I would love to hear from anybody who has questions about the scan equipment. They can get in touch with me at PETA, and I'd be happy to take phone calls or answer emails about the scan equipment if you're curious about it. The scan equipment is the most sophisticated in development right now. There are a number of universities that are also looking at scan equipment. Some of them have the weakness of a moving arm, which obviously around a high-strung horse is not a good idea. But anyway, that will do it for me, and thank you very much for watching this, rather less than exciting video, and I hope that the rest of your week goes very well. Thank you.